Last week in the NASCAR Cup Series, we saw Harrison Burton, a driver who is 34th and last in the standings out of all of the full-time competitors, win his way into the playoffs at Daytona. This got me thinking, has anyone in Formula 1 ever been in a similar situation, where they got into the first place position despite one or a number of factors going massively in their favour? It's an interesting question because there have been several chaotic races in the last half decade or so, such as Monza in 2020 or Hungary in 2021, where drivers in midfield cars made their way up to the front due to a mix of crashes at the front of the pack, wiping out several big contenders, and some stout defensive teamwork to seal the deal, or a lucky safety car and red flag at an opportune time that allowed two drivers with merely an outside shot to take the biggest prize in the sport. Obviously, while Ocon was lucky not to be taken out at Turn 1 in his victory race, and Gasly was also fortuitous in pitting at the exact right time to be in the prime position, you wouldn't exactly say that either of them didn't deserve to win. The Alpine on the tricky Budapest circuit had to fend off a four-time champion Sebastian Vettel for a large portion of the event, while the AlphaTauri at Monza kept Carlos Sainz at arm's reach to claim his maiden triumph. So, we've established some examples of lucky but still deserving winners, but what other ways can we measure the worst win in F1 history? Well, one method is that you could focus on a race like Brazil 2003, where Giancarlo Fisichella won in the Jordan that only finished 9th in that year's Constructors' Championship, even despite their massive points haul from his first place. Surely if a car that only got into the top 8 elsewhere in the season once managed to win, it can't have exactly been a normal event to get to that conclusion. While that race is arguably one of the strangest in history, Fisichella and Jordan showed incredible composure by filling up with fuel under an early safety car to ensure that they could get the tyre strategy correct, and Giancarlo kept his machine on track when the likes of Michael Schumacher and Mark Webber spun off in the river forming at Turn 3 that claimed several drivers' races. So that was another deserved win, even if a bit lucky, especially with the scoring error initially that lost Kimi Räikkönen the win. But what other candidates are there? A certain fanbase would mention a race in 2021. Not that one, nor that one. Oh, that seems familiar, but us normal folk understand that what went down in the Middle East wasn't Max's or Lewis's fault. So what options do we have left? We've covered lucky midfielders and backmarkers getting wins but still having some level of competition, and we've covered poor decisions made by governing bodies. But what else is there? Has there ever been an instance where a driver has simply fallen upwards into a race victory, where everyone else around them faltered due to factors outside of their control? Maybe that's the key. I know two examples of this happening in F1 history, and I'll go through the lesser one first. The 1975 Spanish Grand Prix is one of the most infamous and tragic races in history, as negligence from the event organisers contributed to the deaths of 4 spectators, but it also provided a strange result too. James Hunt led the early stages after a first-lap collision involving Vittorio Brambia's March and Mario Andretti's Parnelli, which sent the American into the back of the Ferrari duo of Niki Lauda and Clay Regazzoni, who had started 1-2. Jody Scheckter's Tyrrell dropped oil on the circuit as his engine expired, and both Alan Jones and Mark Donoghue crashed out on the slippery surface on lap 4. Hunt then befell the same fate after hitting the patch of fluid also after 3 more tours in the lead. This left a rather strange top 3, as Andretti was in first after surviving the lap 1 incident, with the extremely unfancied Surtees of John Watson in second, and an even more unpredictable Embassy Hill car of the German Rolf Stommelen in third. To give some context, Surtees was a dying outfit only 3 years away from its eventual F1 exit, and he was a definite backmarker. Meanwhile, Embassy Hill were in a strange position, as their former owner-driver, Graham Hill, had recently retired from driving duties following his failure to qualify for the Monaco Grand Prix, a track he had won at 5 times previously. The very confusing top 3 was then broken up as Watson dropped back while suffering from vibrations, and Andretti's suspension gave way on lap 16. This left Stommelen leading for the Hill team, followed by the Brabham of Carlos Pache, the Lotus of Ronnie Peterson, the McLaren of Jochen Mass, and the other Lotus driven by Jackie Ickx. Then Peterson dropped out after he crashed into Francois Migaud while attempting to lap the Frenchman. Just 2 laps after the Swede's accident occurred, Stommelen's wing failed, sending him into the barriers on one side of a track before spearing back to the other side, going over the Armco and killing 4 spectators. The crash also took out Pache. Then after an additional 4 laps, the race was stopped and not resumed, with Jochen Mass leading from Ickx. Now, you might ask why this would be a bad win, as surely Mas just won while those around him crashed, and he beat Ickx, who was an extremely capable driver in his own right. The thing was though, Mas had qualified 11th in a car that Emerson Fittipaldi took to a runners-up spot in the standings, and every single person who qualified ahead of him was either taken out by an incident or by a mechanical failure. Only 5 competitors went completely unscathed throughout the crash fest, those being himself, Ickx, Jean-Pierre Jarier, Carlos Reutemann and Nello Lombardi. While prime Jackie Ickx was an incredible driver, he hadn't been competitive since the early part of the decade and had been washed up for 2 or 3 years before. Reutemann was driving a car clearly unsuited for the tight streets, as he and his teammate Pache, who were both extremely talented, couldn't qualify better than the 7th row, while Jarier and Lombardi were driving generally uncompetitive chassis in the form of a Shadow and a March respectively. How Mas only led a handful of laps and just about scraped to the win in undoubtedly the best car in the field still running is beyond me, and I think that it's definitely a performance in contention for the worst win in F1 history. Wait, in contention for the worst win you say? So you're saying that I spent ages detailing the ins and outs of a race just to say that it's not even the event in question? Yes. Yes I am. Fuck me, this other race must be an absolute shit show then. Let me introduce you to the 1961 French Grand Prix. The venue for this event would be the Reims circuit, a track heavily focused on engine power on a long 5.1 mile layout with 2 very substantial flat-out sections. The works Ferrari trio of Phil Hill, Wolfgang von Trips and Richie Ginther dominated qualifying, with the closest non-Scarlet car in 4th of Sterling Moss in a Rob Walker Lotus being 2.7 seconds off the pole time. A young and inexperienced Jim Clark was 5th, followed by the Scots' future adversary Graham Hill in a BRM. John Surtees and Bruce McLaren won 7th and 8th for Cooper, while Dan Gurney's Porsche and another Works Lotus of Innes Island rounded out the top 10. Sat just outside the fastest dectet of cars though was the privately entered Scuderia machine of 28-year-old Italian Giancarlo Baghetti, who was making his Grand Prix debut after having shown promise by winning non-championship races in both Syracuse and Naples in the previous months. At the start of the race, Phil Hill stayed in the lead, followed by his American counterpart Ginther and Von Trips, with Moss in 4th, Surtees 5th, followed by Clark and Ireland's Lotuses, and the BRMs of Graham Hill and Tony Brooks. The top 4 began to pull away from the chasing pack, as Surtees struggled to maintain his top 5 position, being harried from behind. Baghetti, meanwhile, was up 2 positions in 10th as he got past the underpowered Cooper of McLaren, having made slight contact with the Kiwi as he went by. 5th place back to 10th were in an almighty scrap as they traded slipstreaming, while Ginther slid offline, which let Moss glide through before the Ferrari spun off trying to recuperate his losses. John Surtees came across the spun American quickly, but had to take to the grass verge lining the track to avoid him, where upon clipping the earth banks also at the side of the circuit, he damaged his suspension. The Cooper limped back around the rest of the lap, but retired after only having completed 4 tours of the race. Ginther quickly recovered from his spin before the rest of the field caught up to him, and Clark now led of a large train of cars behind fighting for 5th. Moss soon dropped back behind the Ferrari of a resurgent Richie, while Hill extended his lead and set the fastest lap, before calming down his pace and allowing his teammates to catch back up at around the lap 10 mark. Once he'd been overtaken, the Lotus of Moss was unable to compete with the Scarlet cars up ahead, and he fell back into the clutches of the trailing pack, now being led by Innes Island, Graham Hill and Baghetti. The constantly shifting order, akin to that of a superspeedway race in NASCAR, allowed the Italian further behind to send a move on Ireland at the tight Muison hairpin, but he misjudged his braking and slid into the English driver, dropping the latter to 10th. Von Trips assumed the lead on lap 13, while a struggling Moss was suffering from a spongy brake pedal, which drew him into the clutches of those behind, dropping into the group of slipstreaming cars. The race continued in a similar vein until the 20th tour, when the German leader pulled into the pits to retire, with water pouring from his exhaust. Baghetti had advanced to the front of the chaotic runners in 3rd, behind his Ferrari counterparts, while the Swede Joe Bonnier moved into 6th as Moss had to pit for a new brake pedal. The Lotus pair of Ireland and Clark moved past the privateer Ferrari in front of them, then Gurney and Bonnier's Porsches overtook all 3 of them to move into 3rd and 4th respectively. Baghetti reassumed the front position in the pack of cars far behind the distant leaders on lap 29, as despite the silver cars having more grunt down the straights, he was able to outbrake both of the Porsches on the approach to the 2 hairpins on the track. Jim Clark had a stone flick up and hit his pair of goggles, then as he went to switch eyewear to the spare pair hanging around his neck, the change was enough to see him drop off the back of the slipstreaming pack in front and be stuck in 6th place, and in no man's land. On the 38th tour of the circuit, it was Ginther who crossed the start-finish line in the lead, and he was followed by Sterling Moss, whose car appeared to be pretty torn up. The Brit then gestured to the Ferrari pit crew that the previous leader, Phil Hill, was out of the race, as what had transpired was that damaged tarmac at the Tilwars hairpin had pitched the first place Scuderia car into a spin, and Moss had been unable to avoid him when he came across the stationary vehicle, just like John Surtees had earlier in the race with Richie Ginther. The impact from their collision gave the British Lotus driver suspension failure, but Hill's engine had stalled, and he was unable to get back going again quickly. The other American Ferrari driver thus assumed first place, followed by Baghetti, Gurney and Bonnier. Soon after though, the sole remaining works Scarlet machine, still in contention, of Ginther, came back to the pits as he lost oil pressure, but new rules prevented his team from topping up his tanks, so he was sent back out on track to attempt to put up a fight to the closing pack behind. A previously assumed to be retired Hill got back started again on lap 42, albeit 2 laps down, but while he got restarted, his teammate Ginther stopped out on the circuit, with his issues from earlier finally subsiding, leaving Baghetti in the lead, although the Italian debutant was being harried by Gurney and Bonnier behind. The two Porsches had an advantage on the long straights, but the superior Ferrari chassis allowed the rookie to re-overtake the pair in the braking zones for the 2 hairpins that made up half of the significant corners on the circuit. Baghetti and Gurney were practically neck and neck with 2 laps to go, and Bonnier was right on their tail, ready to pounce on any errors. However, due to the extreme heat the race was held in, which had forced several teams to cut out body panels situated around the drivers' bodies to help them stay cool, was also affecting the cars. The Swede in 3rd place had been running behind the wake of the leading pair for so long that he crawled to a stop with just 1.5 tours of the track remaining, having boiled both his engine oil and coolant. Clark moved into 3rd place, with teammate Ireland behind, while Baghetti and Gurney continued to duel for the win. The Italian led as they went on to the final lap, and stayed in that position through the sweeping bends that opened up the circuit, defending from Gurney until the American lunged his car up the inside into the final corner at Tilwars. However, it was not over yet, as there was still a long run down to the finish line, and Baghetti sat gaining in his wake before pulling alongside, then ahead with only 300 yards to go. Gurney's superior straight line speed meant that he was able to fight coming to the checkered flag, but it was an insufficient effort, and the gap was a mere 1/10 of a second as Baghetti crossed the finish line first. The Italian became the 3rd driver in Formula 1 history to win a race on his Grand Prix debut, and the only competitor to win their opening 3 races if we include non-championship events too. The other 2 debutant wins were caveats, as Giuseppe Farina won the first ever F1 event in Silverstone in 1950, while Johnny Parsons won the inaugural Indianapolis 500 that counted towards the World Championship in the same year. Jacques Villeneuve got close to equalling this record in 1996, but it's likely that unless the Mercedes becomes a rocket ship next year and Andrea Kimi Antonelli can live up to his hype, we will never see another debutant winner in F1 again, as most drivers start in backmarker or midfield teams. Back to the topic of this video though, despite being victorious so early in his career, Giancarlo Baghetti never won another Grand Prix, nor even got another podium in the rest of his stint in the top category of European-based open-wheel racing. He retired from both of the other 2 events he did in 1961, getting a fastest lap in a tragic Italian race, but Ferrari slumped to 6th in the constructors' standings the year after, getting a best result of 4th in Zandvoort. He then joined the failed Scuderia breakaway team ATS, led by Carlo Chiti in 1963, but finished only the race in Monza, 23 laps down. His last full-time-ish season came in 1964, driving privateer BRMs, then throughout the next 3 years made one-off starts at his home race, failing to reach the checkered flag in any of them. So what's the point of this video then? Yes, Baghetti had a completely anonymous career after his win, but he got the victory over some very experienced competition, so what's the issue? Well, when I explained Jochen Massa's triumph in Spain in 1975, I mentioned how 10 of the 11 drivers who started in front of him ended up retiring due to factors outside of their control. So let's do a similar test for this example. Baghetti started 12th, despite having a car only 10 horsepower down on the works Ferrari machines, and was nearly 3 seconds slower than the slowest works entry, that being of Ginther in 3rd. Directly in front of him on the grid was Tony Brooks's BRM. Not only was this machine extremely uncompetitive, but the Brit retired on lap 4 due to overheating. Inez Ireland, who started 10th, managed to finish 4th, but again, his car was far less competitive than Baghetti's. Dan Gurney was the best yardstick yet, but still, anyone who qualifies 5 seconds off the pole time shouldn't be fighting for the win. Bruce McLaren, who was 8th on the grid, eventually finished 5th, but again, the Cooper was quite far down on power, along with his teammate John Surtees, who retired after colliding with Ginther early on. Graham Hill had an anonymous drive to 6th in the weak BRM car, while a highly inexperienced Jim Clark, who qualified 5th, finished 3rd place in the slow Lotus. Sterling Moss's privateer machine, designed by Colin Chapman, suffered from both a spongy brake pedal and a crash with another car, while the Ferrari trio of Phil Hill, Wolfgang von Trips and Richie Ginther all fell out of contention due to mechanical issues, or in Hill's case, going over a damaged piece of road. So of the 11 drivers who started ahead of Baghetti, 5 of them retired or fell back due to reliability or other non-driver error concerns, while all the other cars, bar Gurney's and Bonnier's Porsches, were down on power to his near top of the line Ferrari. But surely then, if he managed to beat Gurney when the American had a higher top speed car on a track dominated by straights, he still deserved the win. I don't think that's a good explanation, because although the German cars were better on the flat-out portions of the circuit, it's easy to just sit in someone's slipstream and then outbrake them in a lighter and more agile Ferrari. Baghetti had the second fastest car in this race, only slower than the Works Scuderia entries, yet he still took over half the race to make it past all of the underpowered British cars, and only looked into first place when the main Scarlet competitors hit mechanical troubles. All he had to do, once he and the Porsches assumed the lead on what was most certainly just a drafting track, as had been proven in 1953 by Mike Hawthorne in the race of the century, was just beat a slower car in the braking zones. The weaknesses of his machine were nulled out by the slipstream, and literally every single car that finished, bar Gurney, was vastly inferior to his, and even then he still only just won. You can also look at the rest of his career to prove his lack of proper talent. He never outqualified any of his Ferrari teammates in the 2 seasons he spent there, and never beat Phil Hill in any of his sessions where they both drove for ATS in 1963. Now, it would be harsh to call Baghetti awful for never outqualifying a literal world champion, but even the vastly inexperienced and young drivers, Lorenzo Bandini and Ricardo Rodriguez, had a significant advantage over him. Baghetti looked his way into having the best car to finish the 1961 French Grand Prix, and while most wins take skill, this one didn't, as everyone in front of him either fell off the track or were in much worse machinery. The thing is though, some of you might point to another surprise winner in the drafting race, where Peter Geffen won the 1971 Italian Grand Prix by essentially doing the same thing, but drafting to the lead of a 5-car pack, when everyone has a fairly competitive car, is far different to Baghetti's situation. Slipstreaming is a very important skill in racing. That's why NASCAR drivers are very underrated outside of the stock car racing scene, because everyone thinks they just turn left and it's really easy, when actually that couldn't be further from the truth. While drafting to the lead of a multi-car pack requires talent, sitting in the slipstream of a faster car on a straight, then pulling out and overtaking him in the braking zones, where you're better, doesn't require anything. Giancarlo Baghetti is arguably the worst driver to win a Formula 1 Grand Prix, and in my opinion is the owner of the worst win in F1 history. This video was inspired by the story I mentioned right at the beginning of the video, as Harrison Burton won a NASCAR race despite being 34th and last in the points standings after only having one other top 10 finish all year, and it jogged my memory of more underdog victories like those of Fisichella, Jochen Mass and Giancarlo Baghetti himself. As well as providing an educational tale to a very unknown race, I hope this piece convinces those who may have not even previously given NASCAR a chance to go back and watch the extended highlights of the 2024 Coke Zero 400 to get a glimpse of superspeedway racing at its finest. Not every race is a crash fest at a track where you don't even have to lift off the throttle. They even race at normal tracks like Watkins Glen and Sonoma too. Anyways, with that being said, I think that brings today's video to a close. I hope you enjoyed me detailing the worst win in F1 history, and if you did, please remember to like, comment and subscribe to see more content from me in the future. You can also subscribe to my Patreon if you'd like to see exclusive content, get videos a day early, and have an opportunity to converse with me personally for as little as $1 per month. Big shout out to my already existing Patreon subscribers, Andy Lamberts, Eamon Al Dowdy and George Stratford, and you can also follow my X/Twitter account where I post boiling hot lava takes on F1, IndyCar and NASCAR, and you can follow my Instagram for behind the scenes updates. With my shameless plugging over though, I'm Nedzo, and I'll see you all later. Bye!